Good evening, and welcome once again. I am glad you are here. Tonight, we enter the majestic, echoing halls of one of the greatest empires in history. From a humble settlement of shepherds on the banks of the Tiber to the marble forums of Rome, from legions marching across continents to emperors cloaked in the garments of power and paranoia, this is the story of the Roman Empire. Wherever you are, and whatever the hour outside your window may be, this moment belongs to you. Take a deep breath, settle comfortably, allow your mind to journey across the centuries. This tale is more than 2,000 years old, and tonight it is entirely yours. It begins in the shadow of the Palatine Hill, where the morning mist still clings to the earth, in a world not yet an empire. The Tiber drifts lazily through the lowlands, its waters curling around plains destined to bear the weight of marble columns, forums, and the footsteps of centurions. But for now, there are only soft reeds by the riverbank and the breath of untamed nature. Before Rome rose, there was a story, a legend told so often it grew deep into the soil of Italy, so firmly that even the most skeptical voices could not tear it out. This is the story of twins, born to a priestess named Rhea Silvia. She was a Vestal virgin, bound by an oath of chastity under order of her uncle, King Amulius, who feared rivals to his throne. But fate cannot be cancelled by decree. The god Mars, in divine silence, came to her and left her sons, Romulus and Remus. When the birth was discovered, the king commanded they be cast into the river. His command was carried out. The infants were placed in a basket and left to die in the murky waters of the Tiber. Yet the spring flood slowed the current, and the basket drifted to a bank. There, at the roots of a fig tree, a she-wolf found them. She was not the monster later tales would paint. She was a mother without cubs. With warm breath and coarse fur, she sheltered the boys in her den beneath the Palatine. She nursed them, and they lived. Later, a shepherd named Faustulus discovered them and took them in. The twins grew among herds and fields, unaware of the blood that ran in their veins. They were bold, stubborn, unafraid of strife. As young men, they learned the truth of their birth and helped their grandfather reclaim his throne in Alba Longa. Yet they did not wish to remain there. Something drew them back to the wild land by the river. The land of 7 hills called to them, and they answered. Here a new city would rise. But Rome was born already in conflict. The brothers could not agree where to build the walls or who would rule. Romulus chose the Palatine, Remus the Aventine. They turned to omens. Romulus saw more birds. Remus claimed he saw them first. The quarrel ended in blood. Remus fell. Whether slain by Romulus's hand or his men's, stories differ, but the outcome was the same. One brother lived, one brother ruled. Romulus drew a line in the earth, marked the city's boundaries, and declared, "No one shall cross the sacred wall and live." The message was clear. The city would be defended, even at the price of fratricide. Tradition fixes the date, April 21, 753 years before the birth of Christ. What mattered was not stone nor border, but the will behind them. The city bore Romulus's name, and he became its first king. The new city grew in circles, simple huts, wooden walls, and the first shrines to unknown gods. Men from neighboring tribes came, but women were scarce. Then Romulus staged a cunning feast, the infamous abduction of the Sabine women. They were forced into marriage with Romans, a brutal deed, yet it bound two peoples. The Sabines were reconciled, and the city expanded again. Romulus ruled long, but his end was as mysterious as his beginning. One day he vanished in a storm. The people believed he ascended and became a god. Whether truth or not, the city endured. Rome was born in violence, forged by ambition, and marked by divine favor. The city of Romulus was no solitary dream. Rome grew not only in numbers, but in the complexity of its nature. It became a city of mingled tribes and fragile alliances. Laws sought to tame ancient instincts. After Romulus vanished, the throne was empty, and others took it. For 200 years, Rome was ruled by kings. Tradition preserves 7 names. The second, Numa Pompilius, a wise Sabine, devout and peaceful. If Romulus built walls and forged weapons, Numa shaped calendars, temples, and priestly colleges. He taught the people to sacrifice and keep peace. Thus Rome gained rhythm and tradition. Other kings left their mark. Tullus Hostilius spurned peace, glorified war. He destroyed Alba Longa and moved its nobility to Rome, enlarging the Senate. Ancus Marcius built bridges across the Tiber and secured the West. Rome ceased to be a village. Monarchy held power, but not absolute. The Council of Elders, the Senate, advised the king. The people were divided into curiae and took part in assemblies, though their voice was faint. The last 3 kings were Etruscans. With them came new knowledge of engineering and religion. Under Tarquinius Priscus began the building of the Circus Maximus. Under Servius Tullius came the census, the division of the city into districts, and reorganization of the army. They said he was born of a slave, yet rose by labor. His reign ended in blood, slain by his son-in-law, who became the last king. Lucius Tarquinius Superbus seized power by force. He ruled cruelly, without the Senate's counsel. His projects were grand, the temple of Jupiter on the Capitoline Hill, but his methods ruthless. The end came not in battle, but from his own house. His son Sextus violated the noblewoman Lucretia. Her suicide sparked a storm. Lucius Junius Brutus led a revolt. The king and his line were cast out. Monarchy fell. In its place rose the Republic, res publica, the common matter. Power now lay not with a king, but with magistrates elected by citizens. In memory of tyranny, no man would again be called king. Instead of a crown, 2 consuls, elected yearly. The Senate remained a council of elders. Popular assemblies appeared, though not all voices were equal. On parchment, the system seemed balanced, but in life, power is never still. The enemy of the young republic was not Carthage, nor the Gauls, but the tension between patricians and plebeians. Patricians, the ancient families, landowners whose grandfathers sat in the king's council. Plebeians, farmers, craftsmen, and soldiers who fought for the city, yet lacked rights. Laws were unwritten, known only to the nobles. In 494 BC, the plebeians refused to submit. They withdrew from the city and demanded representation. The patricians were forced to yield. Thus was born the office of the tribunes of the people, sacred defenders of the commoners. They gained the power to veto unjust acts of senate or consuls. It was a victory, but only the first in a long struggle. The plebeians demanded the laws be written, that justice be visible, that privilege be balanced by the needs of the many. In time they won the 12 Tables, the first code of Roman law, engraved in bronze and set in the Forum. Now no citizen, high or low, could claim ignorance or be bound by hidden rules. These victories were hard won and never final. Power, once held, is rarely given up without struggle. Patrician families adapted, yielding a little, tightening their grip elsewhere. Plebeians gained access to new offices, but the path to equality was long and uneven. Yet the foundation was laid. Through protest and patience, Rome was building a republic not of perfection, but of persistence. It learned that stability is not inherited, it must be earned, and that greatness is born not in silence, but in quarrel, in pressure, and in compromise. But beyond the city walls, other trials loomed. Rome was not the only city on the Italian peninsula. It was one among many, neighbor to tribes and proud peoples who would not yield easily. Rome fought the Latins, clashed with the Sabines and the Volsci, hardened itself to the rhythm of endless wars. In 390 BC, disaster struck. From the north came an army of Gauls, and the city's defenses collapsed. The Senate was slaughtered. Legend says only the sacred geese of Juno saved the capital, their cries rousing the guards as the Gauls scaled the hill by night. But it was not enough. Rome was sacked, its streets filled with fire and blood, and the survivors paid ransom in gold for the city's freedom. It was a wound that never healed, a humiliation that steeled Roman resolve. From the ashes they rose. They strengthened the walls, reformed the army, and swore such shame would never return. The Republic endured. It stumbled and changed, broke and rebuilt itself. In a few generations, Rome became no longer a city of kings, yet not quite a state of law. It was a living body, growing stronger, mending its fractures again and again. Citizens quarreled, rebelled, served. Legions hardened, offices multiplied, and the dream of the Republic, not yet clear in its final shape, pulsed in every law, every sword, every stone laid in the rising city. Rome grew not because it was destined, but because it fought. The hills and valleys of Italy were not empty, waiting for a master. They were filled with ancient towns, mountain tribes, Greek colonies on the coasts, and Etruscan lords who had ruled before Rome was born. The conquest of Italy was neither quick nor easy. Every step was won in battle. The tale of Rome's rise, from fragile town to master of Italy, is a chain of exhausting struggles, each leaving behind the foundation for the next. After the Gallic sack of 390 BCE, Rome hardened its borders and began to look beyond them. Its early expansion was not a neat blueprint of empire, but a chain of conflicts, broken treaties, and struggles for land. The Latin League, once Rome's equal, rose against its growing power. Rome's reply was swift and merciless. The League was shattered, and in its place, Rome forged a new order. Each city was now bound directly to Rome by treaties, duties, and rewards. They kept their local laws, gods, and festivals, but in return they owed soldiers and loyalty. To the east, in the mountains, lived the Samnites. Their wars with Rome stretched across generations. They were stubborn and skilled in ambush. In one of Rome's darkest defeats, the legions passed under the yoke after surrender at the Caudine Forks. The shame burned for decades, but Rome did not forget. It returned, stronger and more relentless. The Samnite Wars tempered the Roman army, strengthened roads, and deepened alliances. By fighting, Rome was building the tools for wars yet to come. Then it turned south, to the Greek colonies of Magna Graecia. Proud and wealthy cities, scorning the barbarians from the north, called on King Pyrrhus of Epirus, a descendant of Alexander's generals. He came with phalanx and elephants, and though he defeated the Romans in the first battles, each victory cost him dearly. "Another such victory, and I am undone," Pyrrhus said. His campaign collapsed under the weight of its own ambition. Rome endured. By the mid-3rd century BCE, no power in Italy could challenge Rome. The Samnites were subdued, the Etruscans absorbed, the Greek cities surrendered or were taken. Yet Rome did not impose a single rule. It crafted a mosaic of colonies, alliances, and rights. Some cities received full citizenship, others partial rights. Others remained formally independent, but bound by military obligations. This patchwork was deliberate, each city loyal to Rome, but isolated from the rest, unable to unite. With conquered Italy, Rome gained more soldiers, more roads, and more confidence in destiny. But ahead lay more than destiny. Ahead lay wealth, ambition, and danger.
To the south ruled Carthage, a maritime power with fleets, markets, and wealth stretching from Spain to Africa. At first, Rome and Carthage balanced in uneasy peace, but Sicily became the spark of war. Thus began the First Punic War. It dragged on for 2 decades. Carthage mastered the sea. Rome had no fleet, but it learned quickly. Rome built ships from foreign models and invented the corvus, a boarding bridge that turned naval battles into fights on land. Sicily became a graveyard for thousands. But in 241 BCE, the Romans struck a decisive blow at the Aegates Islands. Carthage yielded and surrendered Sicily. It was Rome's first overseas province. Peace was only a pause. Carthage turned to Spain. There, a new commander arose, Hannibal Barca. From childhood, he had sworn eternal hatred for Rome. In 218 BCE, he did the impossible, led his army across the Alps and descended into Italy. At the Trebia, at Lake Trasimene, and at Cannae, he shattered Roman legions. At Cannae, tens of thousands of legionaries died within a ring of steel. Southern cities defected. Panic gripped Rome, but the Republic did not surrender. It endured, avoided decisive battles, and wore the enemy down. Meanwhile, in Spain, a young general, Publius Cornelius Scipio, rose to command. He drove Carthaginians out of Iberia and carried the war into Africa. In 202 BCE, at Zama, Scipio and Hannibal faced each other. Where once Rome had fallen at Cannae, now it claimed revenge. This time, victory belonged to Rome. Hannibal's elephants turned back against his own ranks. His infantry, exhausted and outnumbered, could not withstand the Roman charge. Carthage fell. Hannibal survived, but the war was lost. Rome imposed harsher terms. Carthage lost its fleet and all freedom in foreign policy. Scipio earned the name Africanus, and Rome became master of the western Mediterranean. The Second Punic War shook the Republic to its core, yet proved something vital about its spirit. Victory came not from a single genius, but from stubbornness, from the power to endure disasters and keep fighting, from a system that could lose battles, yet never lose its will. Rome not only survived Hannibal, it learned from him, and that knowledge shaped the next stage of its rise. Out of the Second Punic War, Rome emerged not only victorious, but transformed. It had faced the greatest general of the age, lost countless lives, seen its fields burned and its allies wavering, and yet endured. But the republic that now ruled was no longer the same as the small state once fighting for survival in Latium's hills. It was larger, prouder, bolder in its ambitions. The wars with Carthage had taught its people to think beyond Italy's borders. With that came a new appetite,
not just for defense or survival, but for dominion. The Mediterranean, once shared among rival powers, was becoming a Roman sea. The Republic was not yet an empire, but it acted like one. The last embers of Carthage still smoldered after Zama, but they were fading, and Rome watched every spark. Carthage was stripped of its fleet, forbidden to wage war without Roman consent, and burdened with heavy tribute. Yet it remained a trading city, rich in farms and craft. For a generation it obeyed and threatened no one. But its prosperity alone became a provocation. In the Senate, voices rose insisting Carthage must not be allowed to live. Chief among them was Cato the Elder, who ended every speech with the same words, "Carthage must be destroyed." In 149 BCE, when Carthage struck at a neighboring tribe in self-defense, Rome seized the excuse. War was declared. The Third Punic War was not a contest, but an execution. Rome sent an army not to negotiate, but to destroy. Carthage resisted with desperation, enduring a siege of 3 years. Families starved, fires raged through the streets. When the Romans broke through, they went house by house, killing resistors, enslaving survivors. The city was erased. Legend said the ground was salted, so nothing would grow there again. Thus ended the story of a once mighty city. Yet Carthage was only part of the picture. While it ruled the West, the East was dominated by Greece and the Hellenistic kingdoms. Macedonia, homeland of Alexander the Great, had once ruled an empire from the Aegean to India. After his death, his generals divided the inheritance into rival states. By the 2nd century BCE, these kingdoms still held power, but were sunk in pride. Rome, hardened by victories in the West, now turned its gaze east. At first, it claimed only to defend allies, but defense soon became interference, and interference became wars. The Macedonian Wars followed one after another, drawing Rome deeper into Greek affairs. When Macedonia resisted, it was crushed. When Greek cities revolted, they were broken. In 146 BCE, the same year Carthage fell, Rome destroyed Corinth, the center of Greek trade. Statues were carried off, temples burned, treasures shipped to Rome. Greece, once Rome's teacher in art and philosophy, became a province. The symbolism of that year was stark. Within months, 2 ancient worlds, Carthage in the west and Greece in the east, were gone. Rome stood alone as master. Formally, the empire was not yet proclaimed, but in truth, it already existed. In Spain, in Africa, in Greece, in Asia Minor, Roman provinces spread. Governors ruled them, some just, others greedy and corrupt. Wealth flooded into Rome: gold, grain, spices, slaves, works of art. Senators returned from campaigns with vast fortunes. Villas rose across Italy. The city itself swelled, its streets lined with marble, its forums filled with monuments of victory. But with wealth came cracks. The army had changed. Once it was made of citizen farmers who returned to their fields. Now they fought for years abroad, only to come home to ruined farms, seized by creditors or swallowed by estates of the rich. The wealthy built latifundia, vast plantations worked by slaves taken in war. The poor crowded into Rome, dependent on free grain and the promises of ambitious politicians. The Senate, still claiming to serve the Republic, often served only itself. Rome had conquered the world, but was losing control of itself. The first cracks opened in the countryside. Citizens who left for war returned to find their land gone. Latifundia grew, small farmers vanished. Those who once formed the backbone of the Republic were left without land, without hope. They flocked to Rome, forming masses of dispossessed veterans and laborers living on handouts and rhetoric. Amid this turmoil rose the brothers Gracchi, Tiberius and Gaius. Born of a noble family, they believed Rome could be saved by returning to its roots. In 133 BCE, Tiberius, elected tribune, proposed land reforms to reclaim public land seized by the rich and redistribute them to the poor. The Senate resisted. Tiberius bypassed it, appealing directly to the people. It was a challenge to tradition. When he sought re-election, his enemies struck. He was killed in riots, his body thrown into the Tiber. 10 years later, his brother Gaius continued the cause. Charismatic and ambitious, he pushed for reforms, land redistribution, cheap grain, rights for allies, judicial changes. Crowds flocked to him, but foes lay in wait. When violence broke out, the Senate declared a state of emergency. Gaius fled and, surrounded, asked a slave to kill him. His severed head was carried as a trophy. Hope for reform died with him. The deaths of the Gracchi marked a turning point. Politics had turned to bloodshed. The Senate proved it would kill for power, and new leaders learned to rule through fear. In this climate rose Gaius Marius. A man of humble birth, he became a great general, opening the army to the poor, binding soldiers to himself with promises of pay and land. His victories won him fame, and repeated consulships gave him unprecedented power. After him came Sulla, an aristocrat, a commander, and Marius's mortal enemy. When conflict broke over command of the eastern armies, Sulla did the unthinkable. He marched his legions on Rome itself. The city fell not as a republic, but as spoils. Sulla seized dictatorship. Marius returned, and once again the streets ran red. Enemies were slaughtered, their wealth seized, their families destroyed. The republic became a battlefield. Politics became war. When Sulla regained power, he was harsher still. He claimed to restore the republic, but his methods tore it apart. After years of terror, he stepped away, leaving behind a state that still lived in form but was broken in spirit. The Republic had survived the Punic Wars, had survived Hannibal, had endured centuries of foreign threat, but now it was at war with itself. Streets were no longer safe, elections were no longer free, the Senate no longer ruled, it only reacted. Quietly, inevitably, the idea of Rome as a republic, as government of the people, began to fade. Citizens looked less to law, more to force. They searched for someone who could bring order, even if he came crowned. Amid the ruins of the republic's broken promises and the blood soaking the stones of the Forum, a new man began to rise. His name had echoed in Roman ears for generations: Caesar, a name of an ancient patrician line, a name bound to gods and royal ancestors. But in the early years, Gaius Julius Caesar had only a name and ambition. He grew up in the shadow of political purges, saw allies die in Sulla's proscriptions, and understood power in Rome was born not from tradition, but from the moment, from influence, and most of all, from risk. He was charming, eloquent, brilliant, and tireless. He mastered rhetoric, studied law, served in the army, and climbed the political ladder with cold calculation and patience. To Caesar, the Republic was not a shrine, but a game he meant to win. He joined the Populares, the faction claiming to represent the people, though its leaders were aristocrats as well. Caesar won the hearts of the poor with promises of reform, staged spectacles for the crowds, and built an image blending humility and grandeur. But alone he could not rise. Rome was no longer a place where a single man triumphed without allies. Caesar forged an alliance with the two strongest men of his age. Each had his own goals, but together they aimed to rule Rome from behind the curtain. In 59 BCE, Caesar became consul, using the office to push laws for his allies and defy the Senate. The old patricians seethed with rage, but they could not stop him. When his term ended, he secured military command in Gaul, vast, wild lands beyond the Alps, where tribes had resisted Rome for centuries. Thus began one of the greatest campaigns in Roman history. For nearly 10 years, Caesar fought and conquered, defeating tribal coalitions, building fortifications, crossing rivers, and bending Gaul to Rome's will. He crossed the Channel into Britain, the edge of the known world, returning with tales that magnified his legend. He wrote detailed reports of his campaigns and sent them to Rome, where they were read aloud like epics. The people adored him. His soldiers worshipped him. His enemies feared him, and all the while his power grew, greater than any man's before him without a crown. But power cannot be shared forever. Crassus perished in the east, chasing his own glory. Pompey, left in Rome, grew colder, more suspicious. The Senate, led by Caesar's rivals, resolved to strip him of command and put him on trial. They feared his might and what he would do next. Caesar was ordered back to Rome, but without his army. This line was drawn not by law, but by fear. Yet Caesar knew better than any, crossing boundaries is how power is taken. In 49 BCE, he led his legions across the Rubicon, a shallow stream dividing his province from Italy. It was an act of treason. It was a declaration. He chose civil war over submission. According to legend, as he crossed, he spoke words that would echo for centuries. The die is cast. Rome fell into chaos. Pompey fled east, gathering forces in Greece. He followed. Former allies became enemies. In 48 BCE, at Pharsalus, Caesar's legions shattered Pompey's army, though outnumbered. Pompey escaped to Egypt, where he was slain in hopes of pleasing the victor. He was presented with his severed head. He did not smile. He wept. Whether from grief or calculation, none could tell. In Egypt, he was drawn into dynastic intrigues and joined with Cleopatra, dazzling, commanding queen, who became his lover and bore his son. Together they sailed the Nile, dreaming of the future. Returning to Rome, he faced no resistance. He was named dictator, first for a year, then for 10, then for life. He reformed the calendar, enlarged the Senate, founded colonies for veterans, passed laws easing debts and feeding the people. He avoided the title of king, but accepted honors that erased the line. His statues rose in the squares. His face was stamped on coins. He sat in the Senate on a golden chair in purple, answerable only to himself. The Republic became memory, and in its shadow, hatred grew. On the Ides of March, the 15th day of 44 BCE, Caesar entered the Senate. Conspirators, many of them once his allies, fell upon him with daggers, more than 20 wounds. He collapsed at the foot of Pompey's statue, his former enemy, and died without words that history could hold. The assassins believed they were saving the Republic. Instead, they dealt it its final blow. His death did not revive the old order, it destroyed it. Rome once again drowned in blood, not for laws, but for mastery of the ruins. The city murmured in unrest and fear. The people did not rejoice, they mourned. In the Forum, Mark Antony, loyal ally, read Caesar's will and displayed his blood-soaked toga. Grief turned to fury. The crowd rose, not for the Republic, but for vengeance. His heir in the will was no general, no senator, but a youth, Gaius Octavian. At the time of the murder, he was in Greece, studying, scarcely known. On hearing the news, he did not hesitate. He crossed to Italy and began to gather allies. Young but not foolish, he did not strike the Senate or raise his voice. He watched, waited, bargained. Soon he allied with Antony and Lepidus, forming the Second Triumvirate, a legal pact for vengeance upon the killers. In 42 BCE, at Philippi, they crushed the armies of Brutus and Cassius. Those who had sought to save the Republic ended their lives on foreign soil. Yet the alliance did not last. Octavian and Antony became rivals. Antony held the East, ever more under Cleopatra's spell. Their union scandalized Rome. Octavian commanded the West, gathering power and playing the guardian of tradition. The Senate backed him. In 31 BCE, at Actium, their fleets met in the decisive clash. Octavian triumphed. Antony and Cleopatra retreated to Egypt, where they chose death over capture. Octavian now stood alone. He did not call himself king. He knew Rome. He accepted titles from the Senate, claiming to restore the Republic. In 27 BCE, he became Augustus, the Exalted, princeps, first citizen. But his power was absolute. The Senate bowed to him, the legions swore to him, the provinces obeyed his governors. The people, weary of war, welcomed him.
Augustus gave the world peace. Pax Romana, the Roman peace. Borders held firm, trade thrived, cities flourished. He reformed taxes, strengthened the legions, created the praetorians. He ruled 40 years, long enough for a generation to know no other master. Yet he left no natural heir. He chose his stepson Tiberius, brooding, capable. In 14 CE, Augustus died. The Senate deified him. The empire he built stood firm. The Republic had vanished, surviving only in name. The people accepted the bargain. Chaos for order, violence for stability, voice for symbol. Rome entered the age of emperors, and the world, from Judea to Britain, obeyed one man. When Augustus died, he left not only a city of marble and an empire of provinces. He left a question no senate or law could answer. Who would be the next ruler? In theory, the Republic had always chosen its leaders. But the empire Augustus shaped could not endure a vacuum, nor disputed succession. Soldiers needed orders, governors needed directives, borders needed defense, and the people, grown used to decades of peace, needed a name to lift in prayers and petitions. That name was Tiberius. He had not sought power, but accepted it by duty and inheritance. The adopted son of Augustus, a hardened general, a man of restraint. Where Augustus was charming and inspiring, Tiberius was cold and reserved, more at home among soldiers than senators' applause. Yet he understood the machinery of empire and held it in strict discipline. Under Tiberius, Augustus's system endured. Provinces stayed calm, legions loyal, taxes collected, roads maintained, laws enforced. But in Rome, suspicion grew. Tiberius trusted few, surrounding himself with informers and spies. He relied on the Praetorian Guard, above all its commander Sejanus, who dreamed of seizing power for himself. When Tiberius withdrew to Capri, Sejanus ruled in his stead, eliminating rivals and hoarding influence, until exposed and executed. The last years of Tiberius's reign became a time of fear and uncertainty, not for the provinces, but for Rome's elite. The Senate bent its head, the people kept silent, the empire waited.
In 37 CE, Tiberius died.
His successor was his great-nephew, a youth named Gaius, known to the world as Caligula. His childhood had been spent in blood and shadow. His father, the beloved general Germanicus, had died under mysterious circumstances. His mother and brothers were executed or exiled by Tiberius. Caligula survived only by hiding his thoughts and pleasing the powerful. When he became emperor, the people rejoiced. Young, handsome, son of a hero. The first months of his reign seemed filled with promise. He granted amnesties, showered rewards upon soldiers, staged lavish games. But then, everything changed. Illness, old traumas, or the burden of power, his mind began to break. He declared himself a living god, dressed as Jupiter, demanded worship, and scorned the Senate. His cruelty was brazen and merciless. He killed for sport, squandered treasures in days, and ruled not by reason, but spectacle. After 4 years, his own guards murdered him. Chaos followed, until the Praetorian Guard dragged his uncle Claudius from hiding behind a curtain and held him emperor. The Senate was stunned, but did not resist. Claudius seemed an unlikely ruler, a scholar, awkward, with a stammer that had made him long appear weak. Yet beneath it lay a sharp mind, love of history, and patient method. He accepted power not from ambition, but to survive. On the throne, he ruled with care. Claudius expanded the empire by conquering Britain, adding a new jewel to Rome's crown. He reformed bureaucracy, improved justice, and granted citizenship to more provincials than any before him. But his marriages proved disastrous. His last wife, Agrippina the Younger, secured the succession for her son by a previous husband. Legend says she poisoned Claudius to hasten his end. However it happened, the result was the same. In 54 CE, Nero rose to the throne. Nero was young, theatrical, raised in a world of intrigue and suspicion. At first, guided by wise advisors like Seneca, he ruled with balance. But soon the scales tipped. Nero craved not to govern, but to perform. He sang on stage, raced chariots, saw himself as poet and artist rather than statesman. For him, Rome was a theater, and he its star. When the Great Fire of 64 consumed the city, Nero thought less of aid than of rebuilding it in his vision. On the ashes, he raised a golden house with an artificial lake and a colossal statue of himself. He blamed Christians, still a small unpopular sect, and unleashed brutal persecutions. Executions, tortures, crucifixions became shows for the masses. His rule grew ever more deranged. He murdered his mother, wives, senators, anyone he feared. At last, the provinces rebelled. Legions hailed other leaders. Abandoned, Nero took his own life. He was 30. With his death, the Julio-Claudian dynasty ended. After Nero, Rome plunged into chaos. The year of the 4 emperors followed. Galba, Otto, Vitellius, each rose and fell in turn. The empire trembled with civil war and struggle for the throne. But from the turmoil emerged a man who brought order. His name was Vespasian, a soldier who had lived a life of service, practical, seasoned, free of illusions. Vespasian founded the Flavian dynasty. He restored finances, began new works, raised the Colosseum, symbol of spectacle and might. His sons, Titus and Domitian, succeeded him. Titus was remembered for kindness and resolve, his reign marked by the eruption of Vesuvius. Domitian, harsher and more suspicious,
was slain in conspiracy. With his death, the dynasty ended. Then the Senate and the army chose a new ruler, not by blood, but by merit. Thus began the age of the 5 good emperors. The first was Nerva, an old senator who ruled with moderation and adopted a worthy heir, Trajan. Trajan was a conqueror whose campaigns expanded the empire to unseen limits. He was followed by Hadrian, philosopher and architect, who preferred to strengthen borders rather than extend them. It was he who built the famous wall in Britain. After him came Antoninus Pius, peaceful and just, leaving behind the memory of a golden age. His successor was Marcus Aurelius, the Stoic philosopher who ruled in times of war and disaster. He shared hardships with his soldiers, wrote his meditations, and remained faithful to duty. Under their reign, Rome reached its summit. The empire became not only a conqueror, but a civilization of law, architecture, philosophy, and art. But all gold fades. In 180 AD, Marcus Aurelius did what none of his predecessors had done. He passed power to his son. That son was Commodus. From this step began the decline of Rome. To live in the Roman Empire of Pax Romana was to dwell in the silence between storms. It was a time when the world seemed whole, as if its edges were stitched together by Roman roads and Roman law, as if no land remained unconquered, no sea untamed. This peaceful period, lasting nearly 2 centuries, from the rise of Augustus to the death of Marcus Aurelius, was not without shadows. There were skirmishes on the frontiers, uprisings in forgotten corners, outbreaks of plague and famine. Yet for most within the empire's vast borders, it was the closest to order history had ever known. Pax Romana was not a peaceful silence, but a silence imposed by legions, a balance maintained by discipline, a calm born not of mercy, but of power. And yet, for those who lived beneath its shadow, it was real. The empire stretched across continents, from the rocky shores of Spain to the dark forests of Germany, from the windy cliffs of Britain to the burning deserts of Egypt. It touched the mountains of Armenia, the olive groves of Greece, the bustling markets of Syria, and the coasts of North Africa. More than 50 million souls lived under its banner. They spoke dozens of tongues, worshipped hundreds of gods, and followed customs older than Rome itself. Yet through a web of governors, magistrates, garrisons, and trade routes, Rome bound it all into a strange unity, not by erasing differences, but by absorbing them. The empire allowed traditions to live so long as taxes were paid, loyalty kept, and rebellion did not threaten its streets. Life in the cities beat with the rhythm of noise and order. Rome itself had grown into a crowded capital of marble and smoke, with baths, temples, amphitheaters, and cramped tenements leaning toward one another like weary soldiers. The poor lived in insulae, buildings packed with families, where meals were cooked on open flames and water drawn from public fountains. The wealthy enjoyed spacious villas, adorned with mosaics and fountains. Their walls were covered with frescoes telling the tales of gods and heroes. The air was thick with the scents of oil and ash, wine and sweat, spices from distant ports, and incense from countless shrines. On the markets, merchants shouted. Schoolboys recited Virgil in dusty courtyards. Senators walked beneath porticos in long togas, their faces heavy with ritual. It was a world of order and ambition, where social rank defined every glance and every gesture. In the provinces, life varied. Some towns resembled smaller Romes, with forums, aqueducts, arches, and paved roads. In Gaul, Roman culture mingled with Celtic roots. In Egypt, ancient temples stood beside Roman garrisons. In Judea, tension simmered beneath the surface. Local traditions clashed with imperial demands. But everywhere Roman infrastructure followed. Roads were built for centuries, linking distant lands in stone paths where legions marched and news traveled swiftly. Ships carried grain from Alexandria to feed the capital, oil from Spain, silk from the east, crossing deserts and kingdoms. There were taxes and tariffs, measures and weights, treaties and courts. Even time itself obeyed Roman order, measured by calendars that bore the names of emperors.
And yet, for all its order and splendor, hierarchy was rigid. Most of the population lived not in wealth, but in labor. Farmers worked the fields for masters they rarely saw. Craftsmen struggled to survive in crowded towns. Millions of slaves toiled everywhere, from household duties to mines and schools. Slavery was born from captivity, poverty, or birth. Freedom was possible, but never guaranteed. The empire stood like a pyramid, its weight carried by the many. And yet it endured. It lived. It survived longer than any system before it. For 2 centuries, through good and bad emperors, through wars and plagues, the empire functioned. People were born and died in its embrace, never seeing the marble heart of the capital. Rome created not just a capital, but a way of life, a pattern that promised order in exchange for obedience, peace in exchange for silence, bread and games in exchange for power, and many accepted this bargain. For a time it seemed eternal. But time does not halt, even beneath stone arches and painted vaults. The next century would bring new trials. The borders would begin to crack, the legions would turn on one another, the gods would be challenged, and the world that bound it all together would begin to unravel, thread by thread. The fall did not come with thunder. There was no lightning strike, no shattering roar. It began, as all declines do, with a quiet shift, unnoticed until too late. The Roman Empire, once a machine of order, stumbled out of rhythm, at first slowly, one false step, a sudden pause, unrest in the provinces, while the capital continued its rituals and games. But the fractures widened. In 180 AD, Marcus Aurelius died, and with him ended the line of wise and measured rulers. The throne passed to his son Commodus, not by merit or adoption, but by blood. And the consequences of that choice would echo through generations. Commodus was not the worst of men, but he was not fit to rule the empire. Raised in privilege, he was consumed by his image and cared more for spectacle than governance. He called himself a gladiator, entered the arena, and saw power as a stage where applause belonged only to him. The Senate grew resentful. The army grew uneasy. For the first time in generations, the empire felt leaderless. Commodus was eventually murdered in a palace plot, strangled in his bath as Rome prepared for the new year. But his death brought no order. It opened the gates to chaos. In the following decades, the empire began to fracture. Between 235 and 284 AD, more than 20 emperors rose and fell. Most were military commanders, proclaimed by their legions in distant provinces. Few died natural deaths. Most were killed in battle, by their own soldiers or by rivals. Rome became a battlefield not of nations, but of ambitions. The throne ceased to be a symbol of law and became a prize seized by force and abandoned in blood. Armies turned their weapons inward, fighting each other instead of defending the frontiers. Provinces rebelled. Entire regions broke away. In Gaul, a separate empire arose. In the east, the city of Palmyra, under Queen Zenobia, forged its own realm. Rome no longer ruled the world, it barely ruled itself. And as if internal strife were not enough, disasters came from beyond.
Germanic tribes pressed from the Rhine and Danube. The Persian Sassanid Empire invaded from the east. Cities were plundered, legions defeated. For the first time in centuries, borders fell, not as exceptions, but as a rule. Villages burned, fortresses collapsed, the illusion of eternal control shattered. Trade faltered, coinage devalued, famine and plague returned. In some towns, populations dropped by half. Streets once filled with marble and voices echoed only with fear and decline. People whispered that the gods had turned away, that the empire was punished for its pride, that the end had finally come. But the empire did not fall. In the midst of the storm, figures arose who held the line. Among them was Emperor Aurelian, a soldier hardened on the frontiers. With tireless energy, he reclaimed lost lands, defeated the Eastern queen who had defied Rome, and crushed enemies daring to breach the northern borders. He was named Restitutor Orbis, restorer of the world. He built walls around Rome itself, knowing even the capital was no longer safe. He ruled with discipline and clarity, but like many before him, he fell to his own men. The crisis of the 3rd century was not one single event. It was a long unraveling of confidence. An entire generation lived in fear and fire as the empire lurched from one disaster to another. A system once thought eternal revealed itself frighteningly fragile. It stretched too far. It depended too much on the loyalty of armies and the illusion of unity. It failed to forge a secure succession. And yet, beneath the old forms, something new began to take shape. The empire did not die. It changed. It bent beneath the weight, but it did not break.
On the horizon rose a new figure, an emperor who would cease pretending that the Republic still lived, one who would accept the empire as it was and reshape it through fire and reform. The Roman world stood at a crossroads. It had survived a storm that should have destroyed it, but the price was etched on every scorched wall and every devalued coin. The next age would not be a return to the past. It would be something else, something harsher, something that would change Rome forever. When Diocletian ascended the throne, the empire was exhausted. It bled from countless wounds, had buried too many emperors, and lost too many lands to trust in fortune and tradition. In 284 AD, Diocletian rose from the ranks of the army and seized power not by birthright, but by the strength of soldiers. Few could then imagine that he would become one of the most transformative rulers in Roman history. He came not with grand speeches or enchanting charisma, but with order. And that was what Rome needed most of all. Not a hero, not a myth, but a man who could stop the bleeding and teach the empire to breathe again. The world Diocletian inherited was no longer a single capital ruling the many. It was a fragile collection of provinces, cultures, languages, and collapsing frontiers. He understood no one man could govern it all, not by the blessing of the gods, nor by military might. And so he created something new. He divided the empire, not for chaos, but for symmetry. He appointed a co-ruler, Maximian, giving him the west while keeping the east for himself. Together they ruled as equals, each with the title of Augustus. Then 2 junior emperors were appointed, Caesars. They were to aid in governance and prepare as successors. This system was called the Tetrarchy. It was built not for glory, but for necessity. The empire now had 4 centers of power, 4 capitals, 4 pairs of hands to hold the reins. It was no return to the old republic. It was something entirely new. But Diocletian did not stop with the Tetrarchy. He reformed the army, expanded its size, and placed troops more strategically along the borders. He revised the tax system, introduced a new currency,
and created a bureaucracy capable of managing the empire's daily burdens. He demanded loyalty not only to the state, but to the emperor himself, elevating his image with titles and rituals alien to old Roman traditions. He wore jeweled robes, required subjects to bow, and called himself Dominus et Deus, Lord and God. The emperor was no longer the first among citizens. He became a sacred figure, standing above Senate and people, the embodiment of order against the world's chaos. It was a sharp break with the past, but the past had collapsed, and Diocletian needed no nostalgia. He turned also to religion. The Roman world was overflowing with gods, old and new, gods of Egypt, Persia, and the East. But one faith troubled him most. Christianity had spread into both cities and villages. It was practiced in secret and in the open. Slaves, merchants, women, even some nobles embraced it. Christians refused to sacrifice to the emperor, rejected the old gods, and denied the divine authority of the state. For Diocletian, this was not mere heresy, it was rebellion. He launched the last and fiercest persecution of Christians in Rome's history. Temples were destroyed, scriptures burned, believers were arrested, tortured, and executed. The empire burned its own citizens for the sake of unity. But the faith did not die. It grew stronger, and in the end, Diocletian could not stop it. In 305 AD, something incredible happened. Diocletian voluntarily gave up power. He withdrew to a palace on the Dalmatian coast, where he spent his days in silence, tending gardens while the empire lived on without him. His co-ruler also stepped down, in accordance with the design of the Tetrarchy. But the plan almost immediately began to unravel. Ambition returned. Loyalty crumbled. The fourfold system dissolved into civil war. And from this war rose a man who would shape the future as profoundly as Diocletian had reshaped the present. Constantine, son of a Caesar, a soldier hardened by the struggle for the throne. He fought rivals in the West, won victories, and step by step carved a path to supreme power. In 312 AD, on the eve of the Battle of the Milvian Bridge, he claimed to see a sign in the sky, a cross of light with the words, "By this, conquer." He ordered the Christian symbol painted on his soldier shields. The battle was won, and Constantine entered Rome not as a pagan prince, but as a man of a new faith. A year later, he issued the Edict of Milan, granting Christians freedom and ending persecution. It was not yet full conversion, but it was the beginning of a change that would reach into every temple, every city, and every home. Constantine did more than support a new faith. He altered the geography of the empire itself. He moved the capital eastward, away from Rome, away from the Senate and the weight of old traditions. He chose the site of the ancient city Byzantium on the strategic shore of the Bosporus and built a new center of power. Palaces, temples, forums, and walls rose there. He named the city Constantinople. Thus the empire's heart shifted eastward to where wealth was greater, cities more numerous, and borders easier to defend. Old Rome remained revered, but lost political meaning. In 324 AD, Constantine became sole emperor of a reunited state. He ruled until his death in 337, receiving baptism on his deathbed, the first emperor to die a Christian. Under him, the faith entered the laws, the government, and the hearts of the people. Pagan temples did not vanish overnight, but the current of history had changed. By the end of the 4th century, Christianity was no longer a tolerated minority, but the state religion. Temples of Jupiter and Mars gave way to cathedrals. Images of emperors now stood beside icons of saints. Pagan rites were banned. The Senate, once the proud voice of Roman tradition, became a ceremonial body. And in 395 AD, after the death of Emperor Theodosius I, the empire was permanently divided. The western realm was governed from Milan, later Ravenna. The eastern remained in Constantinople. Diocletian divided the empire to save it. Constantine reunited it and transformed its soul. Together they rewrote the very essence of Roman power.
But even as the East flourished, the West began to wither. By the late 4th century, the Western Roman Empire stood like a weary giant, majestic in name, rich in tradition, but hollowed within. Emperors still wore the purple, but their power was weak. More and more, they relied on generals, and those generals were often not Romans by blood. They came from the forests of Germany or the steppes of Scythia, men of tribes once hunted by Rome, now serving in its armies and rising to its highest ranks. The word barbarians the Romans used for all who lived beyond their world, those who spoke neither Latin nor Greek, who did not worship Jupiter, who lived outside Roman law. It was a word of scorn. But reality was more complex. Goths, Vandals, Franks, Saxons, Alans, Huns. They were not mere hordes of savages, but peoples with rulers, warriors, children, and histories of their own. They traded with Rome, served in its armies, and admired its cities. But under the pressure of the Huns, merciless riders from the Eurasian steppes, their movement west became unstoppable. In 376 AD, a vast host of Visigoths came to the Danube and begged Rome to take them in. They sought protection and offered submission. Emperor Valens allowed them to cross the frontier, but Roman officials robbed them, drove them to desperation, and within 2 years the Goths rose in revolt. In 378, at Adrianople, they clashed with the Roman army. The result was catastrophic. Emperor Valens fell, and 2/3 of his army was destroyed. For the first time in centuries, Rome suffered such a crushing defeat, and it became clear the frontiers were no longer secure. After this, order was never fully restored. Inside the empire, the Goths remained, sometimes allies, sometimes enemies, often searching for land and recognition. Their leader, Alaric, once a servant of Rome, now turned against it. He wanted for his people what all peoples sought, a place in the system, a homeland, acknowledgement. But he was denied, and so he marched.
In 410 AD, the army of Alaric came to Rome. For more than 800 years, no enemy had entered its walls. But now the unthinkable occurred. The gates opened, the Visigoths entered. For 3 days they plundered the city. They did not burn it, nor did they destroy it, but they shattered the illusion of eternity. The news of Rome's sack shook the world. To many, it was the end of all things. In truth, Rome had been falling for a long time. The capital of the Western Empire had already been moved to Ravenna. The Senate had become a shadow of itself. Real power lay with generals, most often non-Romans, whose armies obeyed gold more than Rome's name. One of them, Stilicho, a man of Vandal descent, tried to hold the empire together, but was executed by his own court. Others met the same fate. With each passing year, more tribes pushed into Roman lands. The Vandals moved through Gaul and Spain and seized Carthage, depriving Rome of its grain. The Franks settled in northern Gaul. The Huns, under Attila, threatened both halves of the empire. In 452, Attila reached Rome itself, but retreated after meeting Pope Leo. The reasons remain uncertain: diplomacy, disease, famine, or a sign from the heavens. But the reprieve was only temporary. By the mid-5th century, the Western Empire had become a mosaic of abandoned provinces and fragile alliances. Emperors were reduced to puppets in the hands of generals. The dynasty of Augustus had dwindled to shadows and children. The East remained strong, but the West quietly faded, surrounded by new powers. By the late 5th century, the Western Roman Empire was but a shadow. It still had titles, palaces, and rituals, but no strength. Armies no longer obeyed the Senate. Laws issued in Ravenna scarcely reached beyond its walls. The empire, once mistress of the world, had become a name, an echo, and a memory. The emperor still wore the purple robe, but it had become worn, passed from hand to hand by those who knew the true decisions were made by generals with swords and their own troops. The Western Empire had become a stage where the last act dragged on in solemn rites and silence, while the world around it changed. The former Western lands broke into new kingdoms ruled by warrior chieftains. In Gaul, the Franks and Burgundians took root. In Spain, the Visigoths reigned. In North Africa, the Vandals seized Carthage, commanded the seas, and in 455 once more plundered Rome, leaving behind not only destruction, but a bitterness that outlived the ruins themselves. These new kingdoms still spoke of Rome with respect, but no longer bowed to it. The empire existed only in name, its borders gone. The world had changed, and Rome could not change with it. In Italy itself, a new figure rose, not from the ancient senatorial families, nor from the blood of Augustus. His name was Odoacer, a chieftain of Germanic origin who had served in the Roman armies and understood well the mechanisms of power. In 476, the throne of the Western Empire was occupied by a young boy, Romulus Augustulus, placed there by his father as nothing more than a puppet. His very name was a symbol: Romulus, the founder of Rome, and Augustus, the first emperor. Yet the boy was neither founder nor ruler. He was only a piece carried along by the storm. Odoacer marched his troops to Ravenna. He did not come as a conqueror. He did not burn cities or demand tribute. He simply deposed the last emperor and sent word to the east. No new ruler need be appointed. The West would be governed by kings. The imperial regalia, crown, mantle, and scepter were sent to Constantinople, a sign of respect, or a sign of the end. Thus the Western Roman Empire came to a close, without a final battle, without a public funeral. The Senate still gathered, the cities still followed Roman law, bishops still preached in Latin, but the idea of Rome as a single dominion was dead. The Eastern Empire, centered in Constantinople, endured for nearly 1,000 more years. But the West, the Rome of Caesar and Cicero, of Augustus and Marcus Aurelius, of marble triumphs and iron law, belonged to the past. For contemporaries, the fall was not a single moment. It felt like a slow fading, like a city where one by one the lights go out until only shadows remain. Farmers still plowed their fields. Merchants still carried goods along the old roads. The bells of the churches still rang. Yet the world had changed. The empire that once ruled over months and stars had left behind only its echo. In that echo, a new Europe was being born. In the East, the empire still lived. Trade routes thrived, laws were issued, armies marched. The old capital on the Tiber had weakened, but the new one on the Bosporus was only beginning to reveal its strength. The city of Constantinople, the child of Constantine, rose as a fortress of stone and gold, ringed by seawalls and bastions soaring from the waters. It was not a copy of Rome, but something different, a fusion of Greek thought, Eastern influences, and Christian faith. The people of the Eastern Empire never called themselves Byzantines. That name would be given to them later by historians. They called themselves Romans. Their emperor was the successor of Augustus, Trajan, Constantine, and Theodosius. They wrote in Greek, prayed in churches, bore crosses instead of eagles, yet preserved the laws, rituals, and imperial ambitions. Emperor Justinian embodied this new Rome. In the 6th century, he dreamed not only of preservation, but of restoration. In glittering Constantinople, where mosaics gleamed with glass and domes reached for the heavens, he planned to reclaim lost lands. His generals Belisarius and Narses conquered Carthage, Sicily, Rome, and Ravenna. It seemed the empire had risen again. Yet the wars drained the treasury, plague ravaged the population, and enemies gathered once more. Even as Justinian built Hagia Sophia and compiled his code of laws, his realm was already shrinking. With his death, the dream of full restoration faded, but the Eastern Empire endured. In the 7th century, a new challenge appeared: Islam. Arab armies seized Syria, Palestine, Egypt, and North Africa. Yet Constantinople endured. Its walls held, its rulers survived. The empire no longer ruled the world, but it preserved itself. Its citizens believed in their eternity. They called their ruler Basileus, upheld their faith and culture, and balanced diplomacy with force. For centuries, Byzantium was the shield of Europe. Yet it too began to fade. By the 11th century, the empire weakened, losing Anatolia. Then, in 1204, the Fourth Crusade dealt a blow no Muslim army had delivered. Latin knights sacked Constantinople. The city became a ruin of fire and screams. Relics were carried away, gold melted down, monks slain, women taken. It was not merely defeat, it was disgrace. And still, the empire did not die. In 1261, the Byzantines reclaimed their capital, but their old strength was gone. By the 15th century, only a shadow remained. Byzantium had shrunk to the city and a few lands. Yet even then it stood with pride. In 1453, Sultan Mehmed II laid siege to Constantinople. For 53 days the city resisted, but on May 29th the walls fell. The last emperor, Constantine XI, died in battle. His body was never found. The great church of Hagia Sophia was turned into a mosque. Constantinople became Istanbul. The empire was dead. And yet Rome did not vanish. It lived on in the laws of Europe, in the language of science, in the architecture of cathedrals, and in the armies of future emperors who called themselves Caesars. Rome endured for more than 2,000 years, from a shepherd's village on the Tiber to the golden walls of Constantinople. It conquered, ruled, adapted, and survived. It forged laws, raised gods, buried nations, and whispered across the centuries that power might be eternal. But eternal it is not. Only memory endures. And this story is now yours.